Okay, so I would like to ask 3 questions and have each of you try to answer it with just 3 minutes, and this way we can move through quite a bit of material. So I realize that a lot will be sacrificed in giving answers that are only 3 minutes, but for the point of this panel, we're looking for 3-minute answers. I also want to mention that Dr. Katz will be leaving at 4. The panel will continue till 4:30. Okay, the first 3 questions that I'd like to ask. First, regarding African American health. There was a study that said community-dwelling Black Americans, as compared with whites, had low levels of total 25-hydroxyvitamin D and vitamin D binding protein, resulting in similar concentrations of estimated bioavailable 25-hydroxyvitamin D. Racial differences in the prevalence of common genetic polymorphisms provide a likely explanation from this observation. So the question, I guess, is, for African Americans, do they need to make any special considerations regarding lifestyle or vitamins or minerals, or is there anything different that they should take into account that affects them more than white people? Second question. Someone complained to me about Brenda Davis last night. They said, I'm disappointed in Brenda Davis. And I said, how come? They said, well, first of all, she's thin, and she's pretty, and she's healthy, and she's not representing what's really happening for a lot of women who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you asked her twice about the menopause question and Pam Popper, and the reality is this is a big deal. That, again, women are being told that they should be thin, with flat stomach, high libido, lots of energy. And the reality with premenopause and menopause is there's a significant emotional, hormonal things going on. And the question, again, is this something that's affecting a small percentage of women, or is this a gigantic issue that's just not talked about because it's just, it's just blown off? So, or it's just not being adequately validated for women that this is significant things are going on and how they should deal with it. And then the third question is, please explain the results of the health professionals follow-up study. Why do you like this study? So those are the 3 first questions.
I guess I'll start with the question about African American health and D3. First of all, I'm kind of glad this question came up because it gives me a chance to metaphorically scream at the top of my lungs, it's not a vitamin, it's not a vitamin, it's not a vitamin, it's a hormone. Okay, we were all duped into calling 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol a vitamin when the dairy industry decided that they were going to artificially spike their products with this hormone to entice people into purchasing them. And again, it is a hormone that we all would make if we were running around butt naked in the sun as we were supposed to be, okay? But since we decided to leave equatorial areas on this earth and move to northerly climates where you would freeze to death, or certainly freeze parts of your anatomy off if you ran around without any clothes, we can't do that. We have to wear clothes, we have to remain indoors, and as a result, we don't get the sun exposure that we need to make the enough of the hormone to keep us in good health. So the question is, how much should we be making? And that's, or how much should we have within our system? Oh, I got to keep this to 3 minutes. Let me say this. If we were running around naked on the savannah in Africa, we'd probably make upwards of 10 to 20,000 international units of D3 a day. I'm not suggesting that anyone take that much, but I think everyone should be taking about 2,000 IUs a day because it's not only important for bone health, it also affects our mood and our immune function. So that is true of everyone, but it's particularly true of darker skinned people, because that means that it takes us longer and more sun exposure, which again, we don't get because of where we live, to make the hormone. So we need to be sure that we're taking an adequate supplement. It's not means that there's anything wrong with a plant-based diet, because it's an artifact of how we choose to live.
All right, I'm going to jump in on the Brenda question. She looks about half her age. She's very attractive as she is thin. She'll have to deal with the rest. So I apologize on Brenda's behalf. And then I actually wanted to talk about the vitamin D question as well. Amen, it's a hormone. What I'd like to append, because I think you covered that beautifully, Milton, is the fact that vitamin D is why we have different skin tone in the first place. Because if you live in an equatorial clime, as we did at our origins, the origins of our common family, then darker skin protects you somewhat against the equatorial sun and leaves you able to make sufficient vitamin D. As you move away from that level of sun exposure, you actually have to be more efficient at making vitamin D. And this was work done, I think it was Penn State, and it was published in 2015. But there were specific genetic mutations linked directly to vitamin D metabolism that explained our skin pallor problem. So, essentially having a lack of skin pigment is the mutation from our common origins, and it related specifically to the advantage in vitamin D manufacture as we moved away from our native equatorial home. So it's configured into the great human diaspora. There's a link really between our often sad inability to see that we're one family and the metabolism of vitamin D, which I find quite fascinating. But if you want to sort of think of it this way, at the origins of our common family, we were all dark-skinned and we were equatorial. And all the rest was mutation and happenstance.
I love that. and it's so true. And we need to recognize it. So we just need to recognize it. I will address, I guess, I'll say in my defense, I wish I had a picture of my mom to show you. She's 82 years old, and she's been making good lifestyle choices her whole life. And I mentioned before, she still weighs about the same as she did when she got married over 60 years ago. These are choices. We can choose to take care of ourselves. And I know I inherited some really good genes. My mom didn't have really symptoms of menopause either. And I know that women do suffer even when they make good lifestyle choices. And I don't want to discount that at all. The honest answer is I really don't know enough. I'm not a medical doctor about the more challenging cases, and if you have a propensity towards really suffering through menopause, I would try a lot of different things, varying the exercise, making more dietary shifts, all of those things, taking care of stress, getting more sunshine, all of that, and trying to see what you can do, and if all else fails, you can visit your doctor and try other things. But I think it's really important, especially as a vegan. The reality is vegans are on trial in the eyes of the world. And when we blow it, we send a really strong message that others are justified in slaughtering animals for food because then they think they need it. So I've been trying for a lot of years to do the best I can to set an example of health my goal is to climb a mountain when I turn 100. I really want to prove to the world that not eating animal products will be an advantage to humankind. I will address the health professionals follow-up study. And I'm sure David knows a lot more about this than I do, but this is a study that is a sort of a partner study to the Nurses' Health Study, which was on about 280,000 women. There were 3 cohorts, one in 76, one in 89, and one in 2010. And they've been followed for many years. And the health professionals follow-up study was about 50,000 men. And again, following to see who develops what based on various lifestyle choices. And both of these studies have been also combined in a number of write-ups. And I can tell you, this is not one study. These are literally thousands of reports based on these cohorts. And these cohorts have informed nutrition policy. And the outcomes have been really quite profound. So we've learned a lot about how smoking impacts health, how alcohol consumption impacts health, why we need to eat more fruits and vegetables, and why red meat and processed meat may be damaging, or at least that they are damaging. And so, and sugar, and so on. So these are, I think, are very important studies because they've given us information about very large populations and what protects health and what doesn't. And they come from Harvard, as you probably know, and you may want to add a little bit onto that.
Good answer, Brenda. And yeah, just a little bit. So the question was, why do we like it? I don't know who said we did like it or if we all do like it. But if we like it, I think, the issue is there is no, well, let me ask you something. Anybody do carpentry or use tools of any kind? Is there any one tool that's right for every job and anything you can think of, right? Science is the same. So methodology in science is a toolkit. And the best way to answer a given question is the tool that's matched to the question. The tools of science are different ways of asking and answering questions. So what I like about the health professionals follow study, the nurses' health study, other large cohort studies is they provide a view from altitude you're never going to get with a randomized controlled trial. So we should get the answers we can from RCTs, but what happens to large populations over 30 years and more? You can't randomly assign people to eat different ways for the next 30 years. Nobody's willing to play. So what I like is they populate an important gap. They provide the view from altitude. I think when we're telling you what we like about methods, it's also important to acknowledge limitations. And one of the concerns about cohort studies is they're not as good at proving cause and effect. They show association. Now, sometimes that's the same as causality, sometimes it's not. It's important to distinguish. And the other issue is, and there's some legitimacy here, it's too bad Walter Willett's not here because maybe he would argue effectively against this, but there is the concern of so-called data dredging. So we've got 150,000 people. We've asked them about all kinds of things for 30 years. We can test any hypothesis under the sun. Maybe we're interested in the correlation between your favorite color and athlete's foot. And we find in our data set that people who like chartreuse tend to be particularly prone to athlete's foot. Who cares, right? So there's the risk of, hey, we've got a huge mass of data, we can ask it anything. And some of what issues from that, and this is a perennial concern in epidemiology, can be absolute nonsense. The best way to safeguard against that is to make sure that you're posing good, sensible, defensible questions in the first place, and that the associations you're exploring are supported by other kinds of evidence and are mechanistically plausible. When the health professionals follow-up study is used that way, and it usually is, it's a tremendous asset.
The next 3 questions are, 1, weren't humans originally hunter-gatherers who killed and ate wild animals to survive? Isn't that what all people did until a few thousand years ago? And if that's the case, then doesn't it mean that we're supposed to eat similarly? The second one is, explain what the Seventh-day Adventist health study was and what its conclusions were, and was this study an important study? And the third is, are there any negative studies on whole food plant-based studies that show let's say, an increase in dementia. Sometimes I ask speakers off the record if there's any, what happens to people in the long run. And I did once in the lobby of this hotel have a talk with Gabriel Cousins, and he said that there were some plant-based people that did get dementia. And I said, "Are you concerned about this?" And he didn't say like, "Oh, you're totally protected if you eat plant-based." He was saying that there was a concern. So are you concerned that we don't have enough long-term data, and maybe there's a concern about dementia that we don't understand? I guess I don't want to be confusing. I guess the question to you is, are there any negative studies on whole food plant-based diets specifically with dementia?
I'm going to go first just to get out of the scrum that's going to ensue. So I think the other two questions are a little fraught, but as Joel said, I'll go with veganism and dementia for $100 because the others are above my pay grade. So I think there's a huge glaring confounding issue here. First, we really can't talk about diet type and not consider diet quality. It is possible to have a plant-exclusive diet that's really bad. I'm aware of no evidence whatsoever showing any association between heightened risk of dementia with a high-quality, plant-predominant or plant-exclusive diet. Quite the contrary. Lower risks of every major chronic disease, lower risks of cognitive decline, lower risk of dementia. But the glaring confounding issue, everybody knows about the B12 concern if you're not getting B12 from animal sources. Not that it has to come from there. It really originates in the soil. This was nicely addressed in the Game Changers documentary. B12 does get into plants. Theoretically, we could get it there. Animals are the middlemen. But the fact is we're not getting sufficiently concentrated doses. B12 deficiency becomes particularly common with advancing age, because to metabolize B12 that we ingest, we need something called intrinsic factor secreted from the stomach. The stomach's ability to secrete intrinsic factor and make B12 absorbable declines with age, and in particular people who have what's called gastric atrophy. That combination of nominal levels of B12 intake, which were maybe just enough, and declining levels of intrinsic factor can lead to B12 deficiency. B12 deficiency produces a neurological condition mimicking senile dementia of the Alzheimer's type. If you detect it early, it's totally reversible with supplemental B12, but if you don't, it actually becomes a permanent form of cognitive impairment. So I think the only argument of concern about a high-quality plant-exclusive diet and either cognitive decline or dementia is the B12 issue. It does become more of a concern with advancing age, but provided you're getting enough B12, and with advancing age you're having B12 levels checked to make sure you're absorbing it properly, there's absolutely no reason why there should be any risk whatsoever. Good luck.
Okay, let me just say a few words about dementia. As David was alluding to, we don't have a quote-unquote gold standard definitive answer because no one has done a particular study to address just that issue. So the best we can do is make inferences from the data that we do have. And I can tell you, I've been to Loma Linda several times, both for conferences and also because I am Seventh-day Adventist. And there are not, elderly people laid out in the street like speed bumps because they're all demented. So I don't think there is a higher prevalence of dementia in that population, which is the longest lived population in the United States. So now, granted, they're not all vegans. Which is one of the reasons, again, we don't have the definitive answer. But if you look at the things that tend to cause dementia, they are the same kind of factors that tend to cause heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes, and so on. So if one may infer from that by avoiding those risk factors, you will lower your risk for dementia. But again, until we have a certain body of accumulated data, we can't say for sure. But I can tell you, I'm putting my money on a plant-based diet. Let's talk about what we should eat, or what we used to eat. First of all, none of us were there. And none of the people who tend to write and make suppositions about what humans used to eat were there. So here again, we have to make inferences. And part of the problem, in my opinion, with much of the work that has been done from an anthropological perspective on human diets were done by Western European men who basically had their heads in the wrong part of their anatomy. They came to this issue with the assumption that meat was important for human physiology, human development, for human survival. And nothing could be further from the truth. When I gave my lecture on diet and design, I specifically addressed the fact that because of our small stomachs and our inability to eat carrion, the maximum number of calories that we can get from a package of animal protein is limited. Furthermore, we can't utilize any of that protein over and above whatever our daily needs consist of, and that's going to be a very small percentage. So from that perspective, it is a complete waste of time to spend hours and hours and hours and risk injury chasing around animals, trying to kill them, to hunt them, when you don't really get a nutritional benefit from it, if you understand what I mean. Not in equatorial areas. However, if you decide to move up to places where plants die off during the wintertime and there's no plant food available, then you have a reason that you have to eat animals. Because, or if you move into what I call a marginal environment, say a scrub desert environment where the types of plants that grow there are not plants that humans can easily eat and assimilate, then you start herding so that you use animals to transform that roughage into a form that you can access. But all of that was late in human history and human civilization. And the point is, by the time we were smart enough to do these things, we had already been given a suite of organs and physiology by our plant-eating ancestors. So at that point, it doesn't matter what we do. I mean, I can get on an airplane and fly through the air at 600 miles an hour, but I better not jump out of it. Because if I do, I'm going to die. That does not mean I can fly. It just means I can use technology to overcome my anatomic and physiologic limitations. So the point is, again, I said this yesterday, even the best predators on this planet can, and I'm sorry for the facing the microphone, can only make a kill every 7 to 10 days. Human beings can't even get anywhere near that efficient. And furthermore, if we do manage to kill a large-bodied animal, most of it will go to waste because it will start to rot before we can consume it. So again, hunting is not an effective survival strategy for people living in equatorial areas. However, if you're living in the Arctic or you're living somewhere where the body will freeze and not rot, then it does become useful. But again, by that point, what you are adapted to eat is moot, because you're adapted to eat plants, but you learn to utilize other animals to get your calories, if what I'm saying is making sense to you. So humans were never hunter-gatherers. At best, we were gatherers, and occasionally we hunted. But even in modern Stone Age tribes, 80 to 90% of the calories are provided by the gathering efforts of women. The men are, whatever they bring home actually is pretty immaterial if you think about it. Because if I took away 80% of the food that you would eat, say, between now and June, you'd still be here. But if I only, if I took away 20% of the food that you will eat between now and June, you'd still be here. Probably be maybe a little thinner, but you'd still be here. If I took away 80%, you'd be dead. So my point is that humans have always subsisted and survived on plant foods primarily.
These three questions. The first one is for Dr. Katz. Dr. Katz, you worked in the university community for most of your adult life. Many of us trust and like universities. Should we assume universities are unbiased, caring institutions who provide benevolent scientific information to the world for the sake of bettering humanity, or are there financial conflicts of interest influencing the information they report? Please explain if when we hear about a study or information coming from a university, if we should assume it's unbiased and accurate. Second question, where do the largest, strongest animals on this planet get their protein from? Is it true that they are all vegans or herbivores? What does this have to do with human health? And number three, are there risks to low cholesterol? Gabriel Cousins says low cholesterol is associated with greater depression, according to studies that he has seen.
These are all for me?
No, those are all for all three of you. Just the first was for you.
Just the first one. Are universities unfailingly, unassailably, unimpeachably ethical and wonderful? Yes, of course. Yeah, no, so it's silly. Universities are institutions with lots of people in them, and there certainly ought to be participation in the principles of academia. And academia ought to foster the pursuit of truth and understanding. It ought to foster a diversity of perspectives and methods, and it ought to foster transparency. But human beings have biases, and those biases influence the work we do. And quite frankly, some biases are more lucrative than others. So even if the university is committed to being unassailably ethical, what if some of your researchers are asking questions that more readily result in grant funding than others? What if those asking questions that the beef industry likes, just for instance, are more readily funded than those asking questions of interest to the zucchini growers? And what if the fact that those with interest related to the beef industry get funded more advances them in the academic hierarchy, so they attain the status of full professor, department chair, or tenure, and have more leverage at the university, and carry with them their native human bias? Now, has this tarnished the reputation of the university, or is just this the normal course of human machination? I would argue that it's a bit of both. I think we really need to recognize that institutions can be motivated by a diversity of interests. Universities are interested in money like people are. Individuals all have biases. Biases don't make us bad. They really just mean we're human. They're things we like and prefer. What I think you have to require in all cases is evidence of egalitarianism, a willingness to ask a variety of questions, a willingness to support a variety of pursuits. What worries me is if there's a strong link between an institution and a given agenda. And the question is timely because as I shared with you yesterday, I was here fresh from some diet wars, particularly related to processed meat. And the latest development in the back and forth tussle there is that the chancellor of Texas A&M University, which is a land-grant university with ties to big agriculture and the beef industry, among other things, the chancellor of Texas A&M sent a letter to Harvard University, the president, asking that Frank Hugh, Walter Willett, and I all be investigated for opposing the guidelines telling you to all keep eating processed meat. So it appears that Texas A&M doubled down on these very misguided guidelines. So I would argue there appears to be a bias at the level of the whole institution. Walter, Frank, and I, for those of you interested, all said, Yes, let's by all means have Harvard University investigate. So, compared to most institutions, universities are temples of, the concerted effort to pursue truth. But they're flawed institutions because human beings run the show, and human beings are all flawed. So, I think at the end of it all, they're better sources than most, but caveat emptor. You need to know, who are these people? What do they have to say? Where does their funding come from? Do they always produce the same answer to just one question? Have they devoted their entire career to one funding source? Would they be able to change what they're talking about and not have it hurt them? The messages coming out of Harvard about diet could be anything under the sun, and Harvard would be fine. It appears to me that if the research coming out of Texas A&M didn't favor meat, it would be harmful not only to the individuals, but to the university. That's pernicious.
Next 3 questions. One, tell us about the study showing the reduction in cardiovascular disease when women substituted beef with beans. Second question, is it true that all protein is made by plants, that no animal is able to take nitrogen out of the air and incorporate it into an amino acid, and that only plants can do that, so any protein you get from an animal source is a secondhand plant protein? And third, what tests should we get to make sure we are healthy? Where do we start? Should we get a blood test, a urine test, a stool test, a hair analysis test, a bone density test? If we are concerned about our health and want to go to the doctor and say, let's see what's going on with me, where do we start? What should we do?
Okay, I'm going to snatch up that protein question before anybody beats me to it. And the answer is only plants make protein. And when I say that, I mean only plants have the ability to take nitrogen atoms from the air, break them apart, chemically reduce them, and then incorporate them into the amino acids that ultimately make up all proteins. Any protein you get from an animal source is, in one way or another, recycled plant protein. Now, animals can take these plant proteins and deconstruct them and reconstruct them into different amino acids, but ultimately that nitrogen came from a plant. So truly, only plants make protein, and you can take that to the bank.
I think I would just add, just to qualify the statement, that only plants make essential amino acids. Okay, so there's an ability to build proteins in animals, but only plants. So the thing that you need to remember is so many people say about quality of protein and you must eat animal products to get the essential amino acids. They all come from plants. Plants make them. It's where they come from. It doesn't make any sense. To me, it really defies rationality to assume we can't get them from plants. It's where they come from. So just to add that.
All right, so folks, I want to point out what these 2 sneaky devils just did. They both ganged up on one question and left the other 2 for me. Just so we're clear on that. All right, fine then. So in terms of all the tests you ought to do, let's make this one short. Refer to the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Best evidence-based repository of what tests actually produce a likelihood of benefit for you. Should you get a total body scan? No. Will you identify tests you might want to do for specific reasons that are beyond this? Yes, but if the question is what should everybody have done at what age, varying by sex and health risk and so forth, this is the best evidence-based repository of those guidelines anywhere on the planet, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Let's just leave that one there rather than get into minutia about all kinds of separate tests. And then the other question was about the 2010 study by Bernstein et al. You want to jump in about the USPS?
Yeah, about the test. The 2 things that I would say that all vegans should have tested when you go to the doctor: make sure they check your B12 level, make sure they check your D3, aka I can't say vitamin D, I'm sorry. Your D3 level. So to make sure that you are replete in both of those. And so whatever else they do, make sure they check those two things.
Good advice. So the other question was about the study. This is a 2010 study, Bernstein et al. Out of Harvard, Nurses' Health Study cohort. What was interesting about this, so this was looking at variations in protein sources in the diet and cardiovascular disease. And what makes it interesting, because there's a lot of literature on that, and I think you've gotten our collective opinion on the topic, this was very food specific. So it looked at, so if people eat poultry instead of red meat, what happens to heart disease? And if they eat fish instead of poultry, and if they eat fish instead of beef, and that if they eat beans instead of poultry, and beans instead of fish, and beans instead of beef, and there's a really nice chart in the middle of the paper showing the magnitude of risk reduction with every one of these substitutions measured in terms of the rates of cardiovascular disease. And this study was exclusively in women. There's no reason to think it would be much different in men, but it showed that all of the substitutions you would expect caused reductions in cardiovascular disease, but by far and away, you go down this plot and you're looking at bigger and bigger and bigger differences. By far, the most massive risk reduction was the substitution of beans for beef, which also offer the advantage of tremendous benefit to the planet. Massively less water utilization, massively less greenhouse gas emissions. Almost all the other substitutions in the chart are in accord with what you would expect, so fish was better than beef. Maybe the one that was a little least clear, but I think it was a very small cell in the study, was beans replacing fish. This question's come up a number of times at the conference, what about fish? But it looked like that substitution favored beans as well. And again, just to repeat what I've said before, eating fish is certainly bad for the fish, whatever the effects are on the people. So you can kind of just see the magnitude of benefit associated with all of these individual food substitutions, which is a nice level of granularity to superimpose on the high-level message that we should be getting our protein exclusively or at least overwhelmingly from plants.
To move on to this question of why are people getting sicker and why are we seeing, more and more illnesses, some real, some just made up by pharmaceutical companies to sell you nonsense. Non-24 is not a thing, okay? Let me just say that. I have noticed that, and perhaps you guys have too, that when you were a kid, that in your classes there was maybe one kid who was a little bit off, but by and large everybody else was cool. Nowadays, something like 30% of kids are on medication. People have, fibromyalgia and this and that. And I do think that these ailments, I'm not going to call them diseases, I do think these ailments are real, but the question is, where are they coming from? How many of you, can I see a show of hands, saw Food, Inc.? Okay. For those of you who have not seen it, it streams on Netflix. Go home and watch it. One of the things that really struck me in that documentary was they talked about the yield in corn per acre that has happened over the last 100 years. And I don't remember, unfortunately, I don't have Brenda's brain, so I don't remember the exact numbers in terms of how many bushels they used to get from an acre at the beginning of the 20th century versus the latter end of it. But the yield, I think, had at least tripled. So think about this, ladies and gentlemen. You still have the same amount of dirt with X amount of minerals and, nitrogen and whatever else in that dirt. But now you are growing 3 times as many plants out of it. That means that those plants themselves are going to be nutrient deficient. Okay? And they make them look pretty by jazzing them up with petrochemical fertilizers to make them grow and look nice and big, but they are empty in terms of their calories. Then what do? They turn around and take this corn and feed it to farm animals. You see, people think that when they're eating, beef or chicken, that they're eating the beef and chicken that their ancestors from several hundred years ago ate. No, those animals were actually roaming in the environment, actually eating real plants, getting adequate nutrition. You are now eating animals that have been fed nutrient-depleted corn, okay? It gets worse than that. These animals are also given what's called growth-enhancing technology, which are a series of steroid implants and other hormones and chemicals to make them grow faster. Because, of course, the faster and more cheaply you get an animal to market weight, the better your profit margin. So people are eating animals whose tissues are loaded with a bunch of synthetic hormones and chemicals and that are at baseline nutrient depleted. And I think that is showing up in our bodies by the fact that our bodies are screaming out in agony for the micronutrients and even macronutrients that they're missing because they are eating what is essentially depleted garbage. And it's showing up in 1,000 different ways. That is my opinion. I don't have proof of that, but that's the best way I can put this together.
Yeah, it's good. I do understand why we're here, but I wonder if I might expand the view. That was a great answer. But it's not all about only food, of course. And I have 5 children, and so I've got kids in the sort of the millennial group, and unbelievable amounts of mental anguish in that group. And they're concerned about a planet in peril. They're concerned about our divisive politics and principles of our democracy. They're facing existential threats, and that's affecting them. They've been born into an uncontrolled experiment involving the internet and social media. Everything about the nature of communication and human interaction has changed. I think all of that is part of the mix. What's happening above the neck is relevant to everything below. And then I wanted to throw in an anecdote, because I agree with everything you said, Milton, but the youngest of my 5 kids is my son, and there's an interesting anecdote about Gabe from many years ago. I was giving a talk at Dartmouth. Gabe was 5 at the time. He's now turning 21. And he got restless during my talk. He was driving my wife crazy, and my remedy was to propose that he stop torturing his mother, run up the stairs, out the door, along the corridor, in the other door, down the stairs, and come back to his seat and sit still, stop fidgeting. So he did that, and I kept talking. He came back, sat down, gave me a sort of cheeky, in-your-face look, Dad, and took off again. And when he came around the second time, he didn't sit down. He just waved and kept going, and 2 kids got up and took off after him. And then when the 3 of them came around, basically every kid in the audience under the age of 12, and people were there with their families, took off. So we now have 30 kids running laps around the audience. A program was born that day. We called it ABC for Fitness, Activity Burst in the Classroom. We developed this at the Prevention Research Center. We studied it. We made it freely available. It's in thousands and thousands of schools. And the idea is you could basically integrate bouts of controlled physical activity throughout the school day, have it add up to 30 minutes, make the kids better behaved, better learners, and healthier into the bargain. But in the aftermath of that experience with my son, and all the years of studying and deploying that program, I developed a rant. The proper remedy for rambunctiousness in children is recess, damn it, not Ritalin. We take naturally rambunctious kids, bolt them to chairs all day long so they can grow up to become adults. We can't get off couches with crowbars, and when they complain about it, we medicate them. That's horribly wrong.
You're absolutely right. I was horrified to learn that kids don't have recess anymore. I'm like, are you kidding me? We lived for recess when I was in school.
I'm definitely not an expert in migraines, but that's the next question. And I think for many people, for a lot of women, it's hormonal. It comes at the time of the month when they menstruate, and it gets better as they go through menopause. Even in men, I've seen it get better as they get older. It's interesting. But for a lot of people, I think migraines are associated to food sensitivities. And for many people, it's things like aged cheese and red wine and things like that. Some people, it's chocolate. My husband has a strong history of migraines in his family, and he discovered the source of his migraine when I was over in the Marshall Islands for 8 months, and he was there with me. He came home about 3 months before I did, and during that entire time, he didn't buy oranges or lemons or limes. And then I got home, and the first thing I did was buy a bag of oranges, and he ate 2. And he got a terrible migraine. He knew it was either me or the migraine, or the oranges, I should say. So we were hoping it was the oranges, and it was, thankfully. But so for some people, it's things that you might not even suspect. And so I think working with someone who could help you with an elimination diet or something like that makes good sense, because migraines are not very pleasant, and there definitely is a familial component. His father had brutal migraines. His sister has terrible migraines. So, and I've never had a migraine in my life. So you may want to add to that, Milton.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a neurologist, so again, I'm not an expert on migraines. But as Brenda was pointing out, there are a number of different triggers for migraines, and it just depends on the individual. But what I did want to throw out was I have read an article recently, and unfortunately I don't, again, not being like my friend here, I don't have all of the details stuck in my mind because I didn't pay very close attention to it, but the gist of it was that ions like potassium and magnesium can help stabilize cell membranes and forestall migraines. And so, and those are, again, nutrients that are found in very high levels in plant foods, and there was a suggestion that being plant-based could help decrease the severity and frequency of migraines for that reason. But of course, that would only work with people whose migraines were triggered by deficiencies in those things.
Neil Barnard has a wonderful book called Foods That Fight Pain, and he has a great section in that on migraines and goes through many of the foods that are problematic for various people. So I would recommend that as well.
Okay, so Neil Bernard. Okay, so we're down to the last 4 minutes of a 10-day conference. People are, they had a good experience, they're positive, they are motivated. Now, tomorrow, they drive over to their supermarket, they get a shopping cart, they walk in. What exactly should they buy if they would, for the next week, want to live the way you live? Go take them through the aisles, tell them exactly what to buy tomorrow so that they could live and eat and feed your family. What would they need to do? Go walk through the aisles with them specifically.
You want me to take that one?
Gosh, I'm at work all the time, so I'm not the best person. But let's say I had a fairy god person who gave me like $1 gazillion, and all I did was shop. I would go through the bean aisle, and I would get several different varieties of beans because, one, I love beans. Two, I think they're incredibly healthy. Get a couple of varieties of whole grain rice. I love wild rice, and as well as brown rice, specifically basmati brown rice because it has really extra long grains. Would load up on the salad aisle. I admit I tend to use the salad mixes. I like the spring mix because it has radicchio, dark green lettuces, and dandelion greens, some tomatoes, other vegetables. Give me some hummus and some rice crackers for a quick time snack. And maybe a couple of Guardian products. Well, actually, I really prefer field roast sausages because they're really made from ground up plants. And chop them up, and you can put them in a stew or some of the other vegetables. And then some fruit. Get my berries, make my fruit smoothies, and some oranges and stuff to snack on.
And I guess I'm trying to think of how to go about this, but I'll kind of explain the way that my diet looks and then what I would need to get. So I generally purchase grains in bulk. So I would buy 10 pounds at the time. And I would buy, I'm not gluten sensitive, so I love kamut berries, spelt berries. I love black barley, which is a barley with a little pigment in it, purplish black. We eat lots of quinoa, a little bit of wild rice. But one of the things that I always do is I always have a bowl of grains in the fridge. And I always have, sometimes of cooked grains, and I always have a jar on the counter of sprouted grains, like the barley, the black barley sprouts beautifully, the kamut berries sprout beautifully, and then the beans. And so one of the things I do for breakfast bowl is if I cook grains, I'll cook lentils right in with the grains to boost the protein, iron, zinc, all of that. And but I always have a bowl of beans in the fridge as well, which makes for instant meals. So for breakfast, my breakfast looks like this. It's so I might have, I just had Dr. Michael Clapper at my house for 3 days. And so what we did for breakfast was, the first thing I did was I just braised in water some Brussels sprouts and broccoli and some dark greens like kale. And then we squeezed lemon on and a little balsamic vinegar and some herbs. And that was our first course for breakfast. And we had a good sized plate each. And then the second course is a breakfast bowl. And this is my absolute favorite thing for breakfast. So a breakfast bowl, I always start with a whole grain and a sprouted grain. So I might have some kamut berries and some sprouted barley, and then it's got the lentils in there as well. And then I have a lot of fruit. So I'll have, maybe, depending on the season, if it's winter, it'll be cut up apples and bananas, but lots of berries. And I freeze about maybe 200 pounds at least of fruit. I do, and I dehydrate some as well. But so I'll have blueberries. Often, if it's winter, they're from the frozen state. But I'll always have berries in the mix. And then I like creamy. So my creamy will either be cashew pear cream, and I do can my own pears. So I can about 30 or 40 jars of pears just in water. And then, so pear cream or chia pudding, which is just unsweetened milk.
I'm just saying, if you really are a cyborg.
and so chia pudding or a homemade unsweetened yogurt, something creamy. And then on top of that, I do a seed mix, which I keep in the freezer. It's chia seeds, ground flax seeds, hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds, and chopped up Brazil nuts for the selenium. So you don't have to take 4 jars out. I take 2. I take the seed mix and the walnuts. And that'll go on. And then I love a little crunchy as well. So I make a dehydrated granola, and then some sort of unsweetened milk on top. And it is just yummy. So that's breakfast. And but it's not that hard, because the thing is you've always got the prepared stuff in the fridge. It's just a quick assembly in the morning. Honestly, I have all my jars, my pear cream or my chia pudding or whatever's on the top, and the fruit, and so it's not really a big process. Michael Clapper thoroughly enjoyed our breakfast. And then my lunch is always a giant salad. So, and I always keep a bowl. It's about this big with a lid, a glass bowl full of salad in the fridge. So I make it ahead, and it lasts about 3 days. So I don't put stuff that will go bitter or whatever that can get added at the end. So I have a big salad, and I try to cover all the colors of the rainbow. So I try to get something orange and something red and something purple in that bowl, and then that goes onto my plate, some sprouts on top, and then I always include something that'll fill me up. some quinoa or some steamed butternut squash or something like that, and then the beans or some sort of baked little tofu cubes or tempeh cubes, and then I make, and I always keep in the fridge a homemade dressing that's nut or seed based, because I want some fat to help to absorb all of those wonderful nutrients. So it might be a lemon tahini dressing, or it might be a hemp seed dressing, or a cashew whatever dressing. So cashew roasted red pepper is another one I like. So some sort of dressing, and that dressing can also be used for my favorite dinner, which is just a dinner bowl. And so you have your grains, you have all your steamed veggies, then you have your whatever beans or tofu or whatever you're having like that on top, then a few sprouts, and then your sauce. And so that's a very typical of my diet. Our dessert is often, my husband and I like just to have some fruit and maybe a couple of nuts we would crack open, or some nut butter with that. I do treats once in a while, so it'll be something like, I even do at Christmas time and Easter, I make these little Easter eggs, or the turtles, you know, those caramel turtles? And they're so good, and all it is really is the caramel is made from either cashew butter and dates or pine nuts and dates, a little vanilla, and that caramel looks like caramel and it tastes amazing. It's not sickeningly sweet like caramel, and so you know, you've got your nuts, you've got your little bit of caramel, freeze it solid, and then you just brush it with a really good quality dark chocolate. And so for the special occasions, you can do a treat like that. And that's how I do it. I try, when I was in Kelowna, we had organic produce delivered to our doorstep. I haven't found quite the same in Calgary, but you can try to procure as much organic as you can. And I drink water. That's what I drink. And tea, herbal teas. Yeah.
So it's now clear that the secret to vegan health is to clone this woman.
And if you're ever in Calgary, you can come over and try it for yourself.
I was going to say, 'cause I'm jealous that Michael was there.
Oh, Michael Greger's my next guest, so he'll get the treat.
Okay, then I'm expecting an invitation at some point.